morning. It is 10:22 a.m. on March 12th, 2021. This is our second day officially of evaluating information connected to trying to obtain an understanding of American finance and economics based upon comparisons with matters ongoing with and in connection with the United States Department of Treasury. Now, there are a variety of ways that this could be approached, and I'm going to approach it with what I have literally right here in front of me. And I'm going to preface it only with saying one thing, that the last three digits of my social security number, actually, the last four are a zero and then three digits. And it just so happens that the three digits that in my social security number are also the three digits on an executive order that was signed by President William Jefferson Clinton when I was still a minor. My understanding is this executive order was a very, very significant part of the Clinton administration. And it was connected to a vision and strategy that was intended to persist beyond his term of office as president, and I believe also reveals a sort of methodology by which the anticipation of former First Lady Hillary Clinton expected to be elected president herself. And so this is not information that I had for much of the time it was ongoing, but it is something I became aware of in the last several years. Repeatedly, this specific executive order is referenced in other executive orders, including under the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now even the Biden administration. Around the time this executive order was issued, I was acquiring my first driver's license. And so, I understand that my life has been very significantly impacted by the fact that my literal social security number is coded to processes that are ongoing as a result and in connection with that specific executive order. I have long questioned, did the President of the United States himself at the time know that this was occurring? Now, to this time, I have not had anyone confirm or deny that. But not only do I suspect that William Jefferson Clinton himself knew, but I also suspect that former Vice President and later President George Bush knew, and that all of those after them knew as well. So, for that reason, when I was going through the information I had and I was trying to put timelines together, one of the manners in which I wished to pursue this was to identify, well, what was going on concurrent to these sort of timelines that were unfolding on the presidential level. Something happened with the appearance of executive orders during the administration of Donald Trump. When Donald Trump would post executive orders on the White House website, there was no EO number. Under the former Obama administration, at least so far as I saw and knew, that there would be a specific listing of the executive order number as part of the formal official title and presentation of the executive order. But in the format that was chosen by the Trump administration into 2017, the format changed. And the executive order was not published on the official White House website with each executive order that was put out by the president. In order to find the executive order, there are other references that one has to go to in order to cross-reference it and to be able to put it in a context of references by the executive order number. So, when I was going through the information in March of last year, correlating with this information that was coming out from the U.S. Census Bureau, as well as the coronavirus.gov commission that had been set up by the White House, I looked at what was on the online site, and there were no executive order numbers. The question also remains as to a distinction between a proclamation and an executive order. And question of, well, what are the intended and anticipated timelines concerning executive orders versus executive proclamations persist. But there were certain things that seemed to fit a pattern, and that were part of the official record of what was available in the end of March of 2020. On March 5th, 2020, under the category of nominations and appointments, there was President Donald J. Trump announces intent to appoint individuals to key administration posts. On March 11, 2020, there was a presidential memorandum on making general use respirators available. This was under the categorization of healthcare. Under nominations and appointments, President Donald J. Trump announces judicial nominee and United States Marshal nominee. And then, under proclamations, proclamation, suspension of entry as immigrants and non-immigrants of certain additional persons who pose a risk of transmitting 2019 novel coronavirus under the categorization of healthcare. Then, on March 12, 2020, there was one nomination sent to the Senate. And that would have been under nominations and appointments. On March 16th, 2020, under nominations and appointments was 11 nominations sent to Senate. Now, these were the references from the White House website, the official White House website at the time, correlating with the dates of concern regarding the auctioning and the issuance, the announcements, the auctioning and the issuances of the securities of concern. So I kept this list distinct with an understanding that one of the things that indicates the difference I understood between the 10-year note and the 30-year note that were going concurrent, the 30-year bond and the 10-year note that were going concurrently with each other in terms of the timeline had to do with the specific reference for this March 11th versus March 12th. And so my concern became, if you are participating in a 30-year bond issue and it correlates with an issue in a manner comparable to this associated with the 10-year note, how do 10-year notes or shorter term securities factor into the entirety of what is established in connection with the original 30-year bond? And so then the concern becomes, what are distinctions that are occurring on the dates of the auctioning of the 10-year note versus the auctioning of the 30-year bond? As if you could set in motion a situation where you were purchasing them concurrently, or somebody was factoring them in concurrently, with an understanding that there might be multiple paradigms that would unfold over the term of 10 years within the time frame of that 30-year bond. And what would define the specific 10-year would be determined, or would tear to what was established on what was happening on the day of the issuance of the 10-year note, at least for the first 1/3 of that bond. So what if you're somebody that was involved in a process whereby somehow you were connected to a 30-year bond issue and it had these 10-year indicators? Well, what would happen after the second 10 years came up? Then what would happen after the 10 years came up? And so the question becomes, well, what if you're somebody, like me, for instance, that's noticed certain patterns happen in my life, and then sees that a pattern I was once engaged in at one level and in one manner almost seems to transfer to somebody else that's going through the same pattern, while I'm doing something cyclically comparable to what was happening years ago in my life, but that is attempting to either overwrite or underwrite it in a different context. See, my understanding is one way to identify this is to say, well, that in the course of meeting certain obligations, there would be certain transitions that would be anticipated and that would be expected to be accomplished. And so you would learn skills in one milieu and in one capacity that could transfer as you change or you transition into another sector or into another role of responsibility. But nobody tells you about this, and nobody lets you know what the standards are, and nobody lets you know ultimately who it would be or what would be the determination of your success or lack of success. Well, then by the time that second 10-year note comes around, what's going on? This is a question. So, one of the things that is important to know is if we're discussing this as I had been, especially in comparison with an understanding that there was something going on concurrent, specifically regarding White House leadership on response to COVID-19, or what at that time was officially called the 2019 novel coronavirus, as well as information concerning individual responses to the census. The understanding is these are under different executive agencies, right? This would be under, as it says on here, the CDC, which is under Health and Human Services, and this is under the Department of Commerce. What would be some of the potential correlations or conflicts of interest if one were evaluating it from a perspective of understanding that these long-term securities may be connected either to appropriations or to policy matters that were having an impact or were impacted by federal policy implementation at the time? So, for this one, as you can see, as I've written an indicator on here. I made a little list, and then I made a comparison here. How would it compare with in the event that there was a correlation? Now, I made these particular indicators before I checked in and I cross-referenced with what was going on at the White House. This one comes a little later. And the concern is that both of the 10-year note and the 30-year bonds had their initial announcements on March 5th. But the 30-year bond had its auction on, or had its official auction on the 12th, while the 10-year note had its official auction on the 11th, and then they were issued, both of them, on March 16th. Just so happens that March 16th is the specific date of the postcard from the White House regarding the CDC. So, on March 11th, which at least on this would correlate with the auction concerning the 10-year note, there was a memorandum on making general use of respirators available, which was under healthcare, and there were several nominations, one regarding a judicial nominee, a marshal nominee, and then there was also an announcement concerning suspension of entry as immigrants and non-immigrants of certain additional persons who pose a risk of transmitting 2019 novel coronavirus. Now, is this potentially indicative of someone setting up an expectation or an obligation in association with the issuance of that 10-year note connected to immigration, and specifically immigration as it connects or intersects with the novel coronavirus? Well, if one were to make that hypothesis and then try to see for confirmation, that's exactly what this says. So then the next question becomes, well, what's going on the next day when the information would then reflect or correlate with the notices from the census? That would be specifically regarding the 30-year bond. Now, the concerning thing to me at the time was, if I go with the timelines that are actually presented in the information, it tears to a 30-year obligation, not a 10-year obligation. Would it not make sense to take information concerning compiling individual responses related to the United States Census and make sure that it was connected to a 10-year obligation? Because census data is supposed to, census performed once every 10 years. One would say that's intuitive. At least I would have. But what if there's something more? And that also brings up the question of, well, is each census itself also potentially connected with outstanding or potentially overlapping obligations set up in prior census eras? It is worth noting that and acknowledging that the implementation of the Affordable Care Act occurred during the 2020, the 2010 census season. That while it was going into effect in March, there were census takers and there were all sorts of matters related to acquiring data for the 2010 census while the Affordable Care Act was getting passed and attempted for implementation. So now we would be in what could potentially be the second phase if, which I have not looked at myself or tried to investigate yet, did something comparable happen with the census process in 2010? And so now we're in a situation where we could potentially be in what would be the second 10-year term of a 30-year obligation associated with the 2010 census. And if that's the case, is there something comparable that happened with the 2000 census? And so then, while we're in both the first phase of a 30-year obligation for the 2020 census, we're also in the second phase of the 2010 census and the third phase of the 2000 census. Now, this is a theory, or rather a question. That thus far has not been proven. But what I do believe has been demonstrated is that there was some very significant correlation between these timelines regarding the Treasury issues and what was available as the public information concerning activities by the president on these timeframes. So what was going on March 12th, which would have been directly connected, if this theory holds, to the date associated with the March 12th notice from the census? Well, on March 12th, there says one nomination only was sent to the Senate. However, there were appointments, the intent to appoint, announces intent to appoint individuals to key administration posts on the 5th, which is where the initial announcement for all, both this and this would have happened. Now, I did read through the actual notices myself. I actually read them, and I do have a copy of them in the evidence. I've not looked through them at this time, but I will before the 16th. And I do recall that among the things were not only the specific individuals, but that there were specific references in the appointments that were made. And specifically, in June or July of last year, this was revisited. So around 3 to 4 months after this time frame, the specifics regarding the initial attempts for appointment and the nominations to the Senate came up again several months later. So this is another thing that we're going to look at to see if this actually bears out and what the implications are. And then the thing that is very relevant for right now is we're coming up on 1 year from the initial time frame during which that 10-year note, that 30-year bond was issued. And it says that on March 16th, which was the day that these were issued, there were 11 nominations sent to the Senate. That 11 metric has been very, very apparent within the last 2 weeks. So how it ends up panning out, or how it ends up moving in terms of the reference points it has now, it's going to say a great deal, I believe, about other things that may confirm some of the other information that accumulated over the past year in association with these kind of references. And I will say that the specific 11 reference that I understand is at work right now in a very significant matter is actually specific to the Senate, to the United States Senate. This is the major one that I have been, that I found recently, and that has been, shall we say, in the milieu for consideration. So how this ends up moving forward, as it already has, but how it also ends up moving forward, especially on and by the 16th, is going to be very important, I believe. Now, this is what I understood was going on at the executive level. So if my theory, which I believe actually pans out, is correct, then there was a very interesting matter whereby this information regarding the 16th concerning the coronavirus.gov commission that had been set up by the White House at the time would tear specifically to information from the 11th. that the specific event that was occurring on the 11th that would then be delivered for a confirmation on the 16th would have to do with proclamation, suspension of entry as immigrants and non immigrants of certain additional persons who pose a risk of transmitting 2019 novel coronavirus under healthcare. I'm going to put something on pause so that I can get something very quickly.